Hi, I'm Tom, and this is a quick demo of ExpressPath, a collection of 4 After Effects presets. The first preset is called Auto Layer Mask, and to demonstrate it, I'm going to drag a new layer into the comp. This layer is just a pre-comp with a photograph inside. And to apply Auto Layer Mask, make sure the layer is selected, and in Effects and Presets, search for EP Auto Layer Mask. Double-click, and you can see a new mask has been applied to the layer. There's an expression in the path property of this mask, which fits the mask automatically to the layer, and then links the properties of the mask to these effects over here. I'm going to tidy everything up and show you these effects now. The first effect is an effect controller, and the first group of parameters are the properties of the mask. Here you can add and subtract pixel values to the X and Y dimensions of the mask. You can also round the corners. If you push the rounding, you can get these pill shapes, and you can also get a circular mask. I'm going to click Reset to return the dimensions of the mask to those of the layer. The next group of parameters are the transforms for the mask. I'm going to start by showing the rotation of the mask, because this clearly shows that the mask is rotating around the center, and that's indicating that the anchor point is at the center of the mask. And you can see that is reflected here in the anchor X and Y sliders. For demonstration purposes, let's put the anchor in the upper left corner of the mask. So we're going to zero out these anchors, and you can see the anchor is moving up to the upper left corner, and that the mask is now transforming from its upper left corner. This is 0, 0 of the mask, and that is because in After Effects and CGI in general, the origin of screen space tends to be in the upper left corner. Even though the mask is transforming from its origin, it's actually still positioned in the center of the layer. In these position X and Y's, we can move the mask to the origin of the layer now by zeroing these out, and now you can see the mask can transform from its origin, and we've positioned it to the origin of the layer. So all of these percentages are in terms of the dimensions of this layer, the dimensions being the width and the height of the layer. 0 in the X, this would be 100% in the X, 0 in the Y, and 100% in the Y. I'm going to zero out the rotation and show you scaling next. So you can see it's still transforming from the upper left corner. If we reset everything, the anchor's now gone back to the center, and it's scaling from the center as well. When the uniform scale checkbox is enabled, the X parameter is the override of the Y, so any changes to the Y won't have any effect. But once you uncheck it, you can gain control over each dimension's scale individually. Quick note and tip on the difference between the scale parameters and the size parameters. Of course, the first difference is that scaling is in, again, percentage terms of the dimensions of the layer, and the size are in pixel values. The second difference is that when you have rounding on, scaling will properly deform these curves. That is going to enable you to create an elliptical mask. So if I create a circular mask first, you can stretch and squash your circle. I'm going to reset everything, and that brings us to the next group of parameters, which are the transforms for the layer. These are the most intuitive and where I'll do most of my work and animation. So when I need to animate an asset quickly on and off screen, this is how I will do it. And this whole process has replaced the track matte animation for me. Of course, I still use track mattes, but when I need to be moving quickly and just getting things on and off screen, this has proved a lot faster for me and scales really well with multiple assets, which I'll get to in a minute. And so you'll notice here that in the layer transform group, there's only sliders for position and anchor. These controllers are actually driving this transform effect. You can see that the anchor and the position have expressions on them, linking them to these sliders and remapping these pixel values into percentage points, again, in terms of the dimensions of the layer. If you need to rotate or scale the layer, you can do that directly in the transform effect. And you can see it's transforming from an anchor point that's in the center right now of the layer. If you want to move that around, you can do so with these controllers, the anchor X and anchor Y. Similarly to the mask, these are in percentages, again, in terms of the dimensions of the layer. So let's put the anchor into the upper left corner of the layer, and you can see everything is behaving just as you would expect. If you want to position the layer back into the upper left corner of the mask, you can do so with the position sliders here. And that brings us to this important checkbox. You just need to manually make sure that this checkbox matches this collapse transformation status of the layer. So if they're mismatched, I've gone ahead and mismatched them right now. The transform effect won't know where the anchor point is for the layer. If you just make sure they're matched, then again, all the transform will now go back to proper behavior. I'm going to reset everything and make the one caveat to that. So if you're only animating the layer with these position sliders, it's okay for the toggle to be mismatched from the status of the layer. But I like to go ahead and make sure that they're matched just in case I do any animation from the transform effect. I don't get any wonky behavior. So I'm going to reset everything, and that brings us to this last effect here, the fill effect, which is just an ingredient of the effect stack. You can see when it's disabled, the layer is not respecting the mask. So that's just part of what makes all this possible. Next up is a quick working example of how I would actually use this in production. And as I said, I would do most of my work in this group, the layer transform. So I'm going to show you how to animate this layer on from the left to the right. I would just set a keyframe on the layer position X, drag it to the left. Negative 50% is going to place it perfectly to the left of the mask. Jump forward in time, bring up my keyframes, and put the layer back into the center of the mask. I like to use Flow for basic curves. This is by RenderTom and Zach Lovett. You can see we have the layer animating on. As I was saying, this scales really well with multiple assets, so I'm going to go ahead and bring those in now. I'm going to adjust my composition. I need to move the original layer to the left. Moving it retains the animation, it's no problem. Everything's too large, so I'm going to go ahead and scale everything down. And again, all the animation is retained. I need to apply auto layer mask to these two. Go ahead and double click. Everything's applied. I'm going to grab those keyframes that we set in the layer position X. Just select the property, copy, make sure you play heads where you need it, and select the two new layers, paste, and then everything's animating as we would expect. I want to add some layered motion to the animation I already have so that the layers are moving forward in X space as they're wiping into the mask. So I'm just going to set a keyframe on their position and drag them to the left. Make sure I apply my curve, and I'm going to offset them just a touch. And you can see everything's coming on. This would work really well with text layers. I'll probably use text animators about half the time, and I'll use this setup the other half. It works really well with Text Exploder by Mammo World. So just create a new text layer and type in your word and go ahead and apply auto layer mask. I'm going to wipe the letters up into the mask, so go to layer transform. This is also where I would just reflexively make sure this is checked because text layers and shape layers have collapse transforms always enabled. So again, it's not going to make a difference for us because we're only animating the Y position, but I just out of force of habit, I like to make sure they match. Go to the beginning of the timeline and set a keyframe. And to bring them to the bottom of the mask or beneath the mask, drag it forward to 150%. And then I'm going to reveal my keyframes and jump forward in time and return the layer back to the center of the mask at 50%. Apply my curve, and you can see that the layer is pushing up into the mask. And this is where the magic happens. So with Text Exploder, each letter, if that's what we want, is going to be separated out onto its own layer. So click apply, and each letter now has its own mask that's been fit perfectly to the letter. And everything still has its own keyframes. So all the letters are animating up into their respective masks. Like before, I'm going to add that position animation. You go to the beginning of the timeline, drag them down, and apply the curve. And to offset these, I'm going to kind of quick and dirty. There's lots of ways to do it, but I'm going to use sequence layers. I like quick menu 2 for script launching, menu command launching, sequence layers. Okay, and then I'm going to extend the out points. And there we go. So auto layer mask is an incredibly fast and procedural way to apply masks to your layers. No matter what you do to your layer, the mask will always fit to the layer. This works really well with replacing your comps when you alt drag to update your comp, or when you're just updating your source footage, the actual files, replacing footage, anything. The mask will always fit to the layer, and provided your animation is in percentage values, these percentages will always be in terms of your new dimensions for the layer. Our next preset is called Path Parameters, and to demonstrate it, I'm going to drag in a new layer. Path Parameters is all about adding parameters to a pre-existing mask. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a mask around our subject and change the color of a mask for a little better visibility. To apply path parameters, make sure your mask is selected this time and go to Effects and Presets and search for EP Path Parameters. Double click and nothing has changed visually, but in the path property of the mask, you can see an expression has been applied. This expression is reading in the user-drawn mask and redrawing a parametric mask in its place and linking those parameters to this familiar-looking effect controller. This effect controller is the same as the path parameters in auto layer mask, except for two differences. The first difference is that in the transforms for the path, these percentage values are in terms of the dimensions of the mask. So 100% in the X will be at the right of the mask, and 100% in the Y will be at the bottom of the mask. Just to further illustrate that, you can see that the dimensions of the mask are different from the dimensions of the layer, and these percentage values are in terms of the mask, not the layer. To re-enable our mask and go over the next difference, which is the show original path property. When using this preset, I found that the adjusted mask can get substantially displaced from its original location, and it's been helpful to quickly peek at its original state, since these percentages, like I was saying, are in terms of that original mask. It can just help me to quickly visually recontextualize these values. Checking this box on and off is just a utility, and it is practically the same thing as toggling the expression on and off. I've just found that it can be convenient to have access to it directly in the effect controller. And so that brings us to a quick working example. In the past, I have preferred to animate with track mats because I get to animate the parameters of the shape layer. But sometimes I just really need a mask. They are fast and they're intuitive. You just can isolate a subject quickly by dragging on the layer. They come with some built-in conveniences, especially like feathering the edges. But when it comes time to animate them, it can be a little cumbersome. You have to manually animate the vertices in the viewport, and this can be a little tricky. Sometimes it's hard to get the path vertices pixel perfect. It can leave artifacts on the screen. And in the graph editor, there are no values to animate, so you can only animate in the speed graph. You could try animating with this dialog box, but if you've ever tried that, it can be cumbersome. So I have some animation now on my mask, and I'm happy with it, but I want some scaling in the Y dimension. So let me go ahead and do that parametrically. So I'm going to click on my mask, double click path parameters, and scroll down to the Y scale. Make sure uniform is off. Set a keyframe in the Y, and go to the beginning of the timeline, and zero out the Y scale. Bring up my keyframes, apply my curve, and you can see that the path parameters can work in conjunction with any pre-existing animation on the mask. If I wanted to do this fully parametrically, let me show you that. In this case, I'm just going to copy those keyframes from the Y scale, delete all these keyframes. I'm going to go to the X scale, re-enable uniform, and paste my keyframes. You can see that the mask is animating from the center now. If you wanted to recreate the previous animation, so it's scaling from the left-hand border, I'm going to go ahead and move my anchor to the left-hand border and then reposition my mask. And you can see that we now have that same animation that we had previously applied. It's 100% parametric. Next, I'm going to go over the types of masks that this workflow works with. Path parameters is intended to work with rectangular masks. That being said, there is some flexibility. So if one of your vertices is not perfectly rectangular, path parameters will do its best to rectify the vertices. Even if you have more than 4 points, path parameters is going to, again, it's actually going to work off of this diagonal. So it's going to give you it's going to draw a rectangle around this diagonal. It's not intended to create rectangles from random set of points, but I have tried to make it so that it's robust as possible. And that brings us to non-rectangular masks. So if you wanted a circular mask, the best way to do that is to get your rectangular mask tool and hold shift to constrain the proportions and draw a square mask. Then when you apply path parameters, just push your rounding up all the way and you're going to get a parametric circular mask. Again, like auto layer mask, if you want an elliptical one, uncheck your uniform scale and squash and stretch your mask until it's the desired shape. So this preset has helped me to keep the mask animation workflow in my toolkit without trading off parametric animation. Our next preset is called Path Transform, and this preset fills in the gap for totally irregular masks. I'm going to draw a quick garbage mask around our subject, and After Effects actually has a way to get a transform box for the path. if you double click on it in the viewport. With this tool, you can transform your path, you can rotate it around an anchor point, but there are no parameters to animate. So any animation done with this tool will have to be done directly on the mask path, as we've discussed before, and that's where path transform comes in. In order to apply it, make sure your mask is selected and search for EP path transform. Double click, and as before, an expression has been applied to the path and the transforms have been linked to this effect controller. This time, however, these percentage values are in terms of a bounding box that has been drawn around the vertices. In order to view that bounding box, you can use this utility checkbox to turn the bounding box on and off. This time, our bounding box has the same dimensions as the one that After Effects drew, but that's not always the case. I'm going to disable this expression and adjust this path to show how they differ. I'm going to add a curve to this vertice, and After Effects will draw a bounding box around the extent of the handle on that curve and ignore the actual path. Our bounding box will ignore the handle and the curve and only look at the position of the vertice in order to determine the bounding box. So when you go to transform your path, these percentages are only being calculated based on the width and the height of this bounding box, which exclude the distance of this path here. So just keep that in mind when you're using this tool. And that brings us to our last preset, which is called Auto Text Box. As the name implies, Auto Text Box draws a box behind a text layer and fits that box automatically to the text layer. In order to apply it, make sure your layer is selected and search for EP Auto Text Box. Double click, and you can see our box has been drawn behind the text. I'm going to add a 200 pixel margin to our text box by adding 200 pixels to the X and Y dimensions. This is going to allow me to show off a new parameter under this controller, which is rounding of the individual corners. And as far as I know, this makes Auto Text Box the fastest way to get per corner rounding in After Effects. This preset gives you control over the box, not of the text. So you can see that I can move the box around, but I actually can't move the text around anywhere. I can show you how to do that in a minute. Our next effect in the effect stack is the solid composite. That gives you individual control over the opacity of the foreground and the background. And will also give you control over the color of your text box. The size of the text box is going to respond to any modifications to the text. I'm going to demonstrate that now in our working example. I'm going to add a text animator for the tracking, and I'm also going to add properties for the line spacing and for the opacity. You can see as I adjust the tracking, the text box is updating. For the line spacing, I'm going to add keyframes and reduce it. And pull the opacity down to 0 and set keyframes for our range selector. I'm going to add some easing to our high and low eases, and finally apply our curve. So this is an extremely fast way to add highly customizable text box to your text layers that always stay updated with your text. And this raises the question that I mentioned before: how do you move your text independently from the text box if that's what you need? There are two ways to do it, one easy and one harder. They both require the transform effect, so I'm going to add that now, and make sure you move it above the solid composite. Immediately, you can see we've gained control over the text independently from the text box, and if that's all you need, you're good to go. If you need your mask to hide the text, then all you need to do is go into the compositing options for the transform effect and add the text box mask. This setup is going to allow you to move your layer wherever you need, and everything is going to come along for the ride as you'd expect. However, this setup has traded off control over the box, and so you can see that there's text behind the box now. There is a way to remove this, and it's going to require a few extra steps, and this is the harder way that I was talking about. The first step is to duplicate your mask. Even though there's two masks here, they're both being driven by the same set of controllers, so they're going to be identical. The only thing we need to change is the blending mode to subtract. The next thing we need to do is add a fill effect. Move your fill effect above the solid composite, and you might remember this effect stack from Auto Layer Mask. It's the same one. Reduce the opacity to 0, and finally, in the compositing option for the fill effect, add our second mask. And now we have control over the text, and we can still move the text box to hide and reveal our text. So that's ExpressPath, a brand new way to control and animate masks and paths in After Effects. I've used this a ton in production, and it saved me a lot of time. I hope it does the same for you, and I really appreciate your interest in this tool. If you have any questions or comments or feedback, please do reach out to me by email. If you're interested in tinkering with this expression that's doing all the heavy lifting, you can learn more about it in the first tool that I made, Path Expression Shape. For this one, I went ahead and open sourced the code that is essentially drawing a shape layer from the ground up in JavaScript. If you'd be interested in learning more about everything that went into building this, let me know. I'm thinking about doing a mini course on vector math, matrix math, a little bit of programming. If there's enough demand, that would definitely be a big factor in pushing me over the edge to make that happen. I had a lot of fun building this and would love to break it down for anybody who's interested. Thank you again for checking out XpressPath, and take care.